Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the first of our Mammal Pest Talks for Biosecurity Bonanza 2020. If you have any technical issues in terms of being able to hear the presentation or watch the video, please put those as questions and we'll endeavour to help you. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Patrick Garvey, a wildlife ecologist at Manaaki Whenua. His talk today will explore how animal behaviour can be used in pest management. In recent years, animal behaviour studies have highlighted the importance of individual differences and how this influences responses to competitors, predators, and their environment. Yet these findings are rarely incorporated into wildlife management practices. Patrick will provide some suggestions on how incorporating these ideas could greatly benefit wildlife management. This work is developed out of Patrick's PhD on stoats, where he studied how they responded to sensory cues and interacted with other predators. A Q&A session will follow this talk. I encourage you to submit questions during the presentation. We will try and get through them all, but if not, Patrick will be responding by email to any questions we don't get to. I'll now hand over to Patrick to share his presentation, Uncovering the Achilles heel, Animal Behaviour and Pest Management.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Garvey and I'm a scientist at Landcare Research. And today I'd like to talk to you about some research that I've been involved with in the last few years, and it's about integrating animal behaviour into pest management and the benefits that can come from such an integration. And many of the ideas I'll be discussing today came from a behaviour behaviour management workshop that we undertook a year ago, and hopefully we'll get to publish this information soon. Okay. So just to give a brief overview of my talk, the first thing I'll be considering is why we should incorporate animal behaviour into pest management. I'll then look at some areas of animal behaviour and look at it from a New Zealand pest management approach. And these include species interaction and risk, sensory ecology, and individual variability, including personality. And finally, I'll just tie things together and discuss our eradication science program, which we're bringing together concepts from animal behavior and introducing into pest management in a really interesting research program. So just start off, I thought I'd give some random examples of behavior-based management that's occurred in different parts of the world and it's proved to be successful. So little spotted owls have reduced territory and they want to encourage them by they created burrows in the landscape and they want to reintroduce them to these areas. And what they found is when they reintroduced the nesting pair, they'd invariably just leave the area almost immediately. So to change this, one of the approaches they considered is using behavior. So what they did is they used whitewash to pebble dash outside the burrow and use conspecific calls in the area. And using this approach, they managed to increase settlement by over 20 times. When the birds thought they were using a nest that had previously been used and that they'd neighbours in the area that were important, then they stayed in the area. Another example is guard animals for livestock. Llamas have been used, dogs and donkeys, and this is actually a very effective method of reducing predation from animals like coyotes and wolves. And in fact, it's a better approach than going out and trying to kill the animals that are actually involved in the predation, because often you get the wrong animals, or where you get the right animals, they will be replaced pretty quickly, so the predation level remains. But if you use guard animals, it works very effectively. Another cool example is whales. Up in Alaska, the long fishermen, when they're bringing in their long lines, sperm whales tune into it. They go over, they hear the boat noise, they go over and they eat the fish off the line. And to stop this happening, what they've used is acoustic devices that replicate the sound. They play this in a different area and all the whales fly over there, and then they get a chance to pull in the fish with no disturbance from whales. And the final example is just the simple approach of painting eyes on the back of a cow. what this manages to do, it's really reduced predation rates by lions in Kenya. And how it works is that an observed predator is much less likely to attack because it's lost the element of surprise. So simply by putting the eyes on the back of the cow, it reduced the amount of predation rate. So that's kind of a few global examples, but when we consider it in a New Zealand context, often we're managing invasive pests such as stoats in this picture, and we're using different devices such as it could be either a trap, or it could be a bait, or it could be a camera trap. And what we want to do, what managers want to do, is get the pest animal to interact with these traps or devices. So how it's often done is we introduce a sensory cue, and this could be auditory or visual, or in this case, scent cue. And this will hopefully increase the interaction rates. So we have a stoat running around the environment, killing stuff, and eventually it detects the scent. So in this position, what we want is to increase an interaction rate, and this is where animal behavior comes into wildlife management. There's the risk of the device itself. So the animal has a perception of risk. It's something similar to how it perceives a predator. Does it view it as risky? If it is risky, will it interact? There's the value of the sensory cue. So what does the scent contain? How important is the particular scent to that animal at that moment? What does the modalities used by that pest to detect scents? So these all come into play. There's the background environment, which is really interesting idea, but something I won't discuss too much here. But what it's saying is if there is, for example, if there's a lot of food in the landscape, you can imagine a stoat breaks into a protected area like a fenced sanctuary. And if it breaks in there, it has a lot of food, no competition, and a food lure wouldn't have that much value. Where if you're looking at a stoat in the middle of winter, a young naive stoat that's trying to hunt for food, a food lure will have a lot more value. So it depends on also the background environment and where the trap is placed. And one of the focus of this talk is that it depends on the individual. So individuals are making decisions. Individual pests have to decide whether they'll approach, enter, or eat a bait. And this is not really something that we do in wildlife management. We tend to view a pest as an average. We put the same sort of bait out, the same sort of trap, and we look at interaction rates. But in this talk, I'll be discussing how the animals are actually individuals and how the individual decision will influence the outcome and whether there's an interaction. So the first area of animal behavior I want to discuss is risk and species interaction. And interactions, we can think about them, I'll be talking about them as in species interactions, but interactions can also mean an interaction of a pest with a device, and the same rules often apply. And there's areas of animal behavior such as risk allocation, fear, and landscapes of fear, and trophic interactions, which are all well-developed area of animal behavior, and they're important in a wildlife management context because they drive the behavioral responses and the demographics of the pest animals. And they also influence the outcomes of pest management. If we do a certain action, it's the behavior responses of other species that were related to the ones that we removed, and how these interactions influence the outcomes. So there's a few areas of behavior here that are important, and I'll just describe these specifically in relation to research I've done and in the New Zealand context. So if we look at the three biggest invasive pests in New Zealand, we've ferrets, cats, and stoats. And we did a study on looking at interactions between stoats and these two larger predators. And what we found is that stoats fear and avoid cats and ferrets. And that would be maybe not that surprising, because we know for cats, for example, they predate on stoats. But we really wanted to tease apart and create a foundation that we could look at the whole in New Zealand environment based on this behavioural foundation. So just to give you a little example of what we're talking about, in this picture you can see we're using give up densities, which is a behavioural approach. The amount of food left in front of the scary predator will give an indication of the risk that the animal perceives. And here you'll see a stoat coming in, and he's feeding in front of the ferret. And of all the stoats, 20 stoats we tested, and this is the same as stoat approaching a cat, and you can see it's a very intelligent stoat because it'll pick up a mouthful of food and run off to the right hand side of the screen. But so there's individual variability because out of 20 stoats we tested, I think it was 17 didn't even approach this food, but there was a couple of brave souls that did it. But even they weren't able to finish the food because the risk of an interaction with a cat or a ferret was too large. But how will this affect demographics across New Zealand? Will this behavioural understanding influence them? So this is an interesting piece of data that comes from the Tasman Valley. So what we're looking at here is in 2005, there was no control done in the Tasman Valley, and this is some of the most endangered birds in the world live here, like black stilt, and what they wanted to do is remove the predators. So if you look at this, this is ferret and stoat capture rates in the first year. So you can see ferrets are at high density at the right-hand side of the valley there, and in the same location, stoats are absent. So where you found all these ferrets, you're not finding stoats. 5 years later, we look at the same scenario, and it's the trap catch rate then. And what you see is that now the ferrets have been completely removed because they're easier animals to trap. So they were easier to move from the environment. And in the area where there were previously no stoats, and where now there are no ferrets, stoats start to appear and be caught quite a bit. So there was behavioural exclusion going on. That seems to be what your understanding would be from both the study and from the outcome as you'd see in the environment. But we can also look at this in farmlands, and 2/3 of New Zealand is farmlands, so it's a very important area to study. And this study was done in Hawke's Bay. So what we were doing is we did high density camera traps across a landscape. This was 7 kilometers squared. What we wanted to do was know the interactions of stoats, cats and ferrets, their behavior and the prey availability to them. So the cameras were closer together than a home range, but we wanted to get detailed observations. We used camera traps, which were each at a dot on the landscape, and we used very good contractors to remove cats and ferrets from the landscape, and this would enable us then to see if there's a behavioural response to stoats if they are removed. And that's exactly who we're looking at. We're looking at stoats outcomes when feral cats and ferrets were removed. And this is a really interesting diagram from before any removal was done. And what you're seeing here, if you look at the top one, this is over on the far left hand side is 12 at night, that's 6 in the morning, that's 12 in the afternoon, 6 in the evening, and midnight again. And under the line is the entire activity of collectively of all the cats, ferrets and stoats in the area. So what you can see is cats and ferrets, their activity, this is time, their temporal activity overlaps a lot. So it's over 75%. The only difference is cats are active during the daytime period here, ferrets aren't, but their activity almost perfectly matches at night. For cats and stoats, stoats are only active and their height of activity is when cats are at their lowest activity. And similarly with ferrets, stoats activity doesn't overlap at all. So ferrets are active at night and stoats are only active during the day. So stoats are avoiding these two predators through time and so that they can coexist on the landscape. And when you remove cats and ferrets, how does the stoats response? So what we can see here is this is where no animals were removed in 3 time periods, and it's consistent. Cats, ferrets and stoats are consistent. But in the removal site, where Graham Dixon did a very good job of removing the predators, what we have is that you have high cat abundance prior, and they're reduced to almost none, and the same with ferrets, reduced to very low level. But stoats, who weren't on the landscape prior to this, suddenly start appearing, and then they go up to the most common predator on the landscape 6 months after we did control. So that is foundational in behavioural interactions, and it shows that mesopredator release will occur when you remove these larger predators. And this is just a fantastic photograph from Dale Williams from a long time ago, but it just shows how species interaction and interaction with management devices are linked in one great photograph. So you have a possum defending poisonous bait stations from a wallaby, and it really shows how all these things can interact together in one very good photograph. So second area I'd like to discuss is animal behavior and sensory ecology. And this is highly important because any management action and the desired outcome are linked together by the sensory cue. So management do something, you want an interaction, let's say removal, and what links these two together is the sensory cue. And managers seek to either attract or deter pests, and it depends whether the sensory cue that's used will depend on the perceptive abilities of the pests. So if you think of a cat and a hedgehog, they'd have very different sensory abilities, and where a auditory cue might work well for a cat, it wouldn't be great for a hedgehog. And also this value of the sensory cue. So this, they're called the 4F behavior of animals' behaviors, and these are motivations, the primary motivations of most animals at most times. I'll just go over these. Fleeing or predation. You can see these terrified bulldogs on the corner of the couch with the big scary cat, but usually it's the other way around. The larger predators would dominate smaller, but it's a very important interaction between predators and prey, and fleeing to avoid scary sympatric species. You can also think about it in feeding as another primary motivation, and there's specializations such as these orca in Argentina, where they'll take seals off the beach, but it's just this clan that does it. But feeding is obviously a major motivation for animals, but there's also specialization within that. Fighting, animals will fight with each other for territory control and mates, and also fornication. Yeah, I don't need to explain that too much, but yeah, it's again one of the great drivers of animal behavior, and it can be used as sensory cues such as estrus female can be a very strong attractive, so it's an important area. So that's what we did. We looked at sensory cues and how they'd influence the 3 species I discussed earlier, and we're looking at how the odor, body odor from cats and ferrets would influence stoats. And what we found was it was the opposite to what we predicted and what was in much of the literature our predictions were based on, but stoats were actually highly attracted to the odor of cats and ferrets. And this was surprising since they avoided the predators themselves, but the odor provides more information. It can inform you on risk, it can inform you on when they were last in the area. So it's actually such an important piece of information. It's rather an attractant rather than a deterrent. And you can see this is a little stoat. It's just entering screen here on the left. And in these tubes here, we have a food item, but we also have the predator, the body odor of a cat. And you can see how the stoat responds to this body odor as it enters the screen. So it's pretty terrified. You can see it getting on its back legs, and it's highly vigilant, but it's also highly curious. And it increases elevation to go to the side, so it reduces the risk, and it's kind of trying to figure out where is this cat, because I can smell it, but I can't see it. But actually it keeps coming closer and closer, and it actually eats the food item from that tubing before it would eat a food item from a tube with no predator scent. So the odor itself is actually a strong attractant. But it's very well to do it in a behavioral trial in a pen, but will this scale up? Will predator odor actually improve pest management? So what we did was I did this project with 5 different community projects. They were all highly important, well-established projects protecting animals such as blue duck, kokako, and kiwi. And the approach was very simple. We sent out predator odor, in this case ferret odor, and all we asked them to do was in every second track, you keep your normal approach the same. You put your food lure in the trap, but we'll just add a little bit of predator odor to every second trap, and then we look at the capture rates across time. So will the traps with predator odor catch more or less pests than the ones without? So these are the results, and it was actually worked extremely well. Overall, we got 150% increase in stoat capture rates. And if you think about it, it's for very little extra effort. All you're doing is putting a little bit of odor in a device. And this was across the four sites I saw here. At the other site, it was primarily weasels, so I kept that separate. But across all 4 sites, there was a big increase in detections or in capture rates. So these were actually different individuals. So while with cameras, we got different results, but we couldn't say it wasn't the same individuals coming back. You can only get killed once. So this huge difference was directly relatable to the predator odor that was put into the devices. And the third area I'll quickly discuss is animal behavior and individual variability. And it's really not an area that's considered much in pest management in New Zealand or indeed across the world. But it obviously has to have strong influences because the behavior literatures will show that these factors hugely contributed to how an animal interacts and use the landscape and interacts with other species. So important factors are demographic traits such as the sex of the animal, the experience and learning of the animal, the genetics, the body condition, whether an animal is hungry or not, and the behavioral traits. And this is one of the key points that I want to discuss, and it's personality. Pavlov was one of the first people to do this, and he was looking at dogs in his classic experiments, dogs drooling, but he also started looking at temperaments of dogs and distinguished between different individuals of a species. And prior to this, it was just viewed that all animals were the exact same. So he was one of the first person to lead the field. And personality is actually a really interesting area, and it's something I'd like to just highlight at the project we're going to look at. So first of all, I just wanted to show you how with the same study approach, there's also individuality in stoats and different personality. So you'll see a stoat come in here on the right-hand side, and what it wants to do, it wants to approach the cat and that cage in the box. But there's a risk if you approach it front on. Obviously, a cat could grab you even though it's inside the cage. So there's a risk associated. So it does something quite creative to avoid that risk. And you can see it just coming in the screen. There it goes. Just shimmies across the side, climbs up on the fence and moves across the top of the fence. And again, of 20 different stoats we had, this was the only one that did this. And then it cleverly just comes along and drops out of the sky. So I was looking at this video and all of a sudden the stoat just appears. Where'd that come from? But it was a very clever way of the animal to approach, and then it returned back the same way, and it was able to approach the high-risk predator, but with very low risk to itself. So that's an example of individual variability. And if you wonder if this predator was a trap, would it also have avoided it in a similar way? You can see how maybe this is important for management. So just to briefly discuss a really interesting, fascinating project that I'm involved with. It's an MB research project, and it started just late last year, and it'll go for the next 5 years. And what we're looking at is managing the individual and not the average pest. And this is linked to the predator-free push for New Zealand. And it's easy to catch most pests, but there's a certain proportion that just seem to always avoid no matter what you do. And these are the ones we're interested in this study. And the pests that we're going to focus on is possum, ship rats, and stoats. So it's great. The great thing about the project is we have a couple of very simple questions to try to get an answer to. And the first one is, why do some individuals survive control? And some of the predictions we have linked to that, one of the main prediction is personality. So a bold animal and a shy animal encountering a trap, there'll be different outcomes for them encounter. We're also looking at learning and intelligence. Learning, you can imagine a sublethal dose or escaping from a trap will influence follow-up interactions. So that's an important aspect to consider. We're looking at microbiome and diet. Again, very important. If you're using a lure that's a food, you have to make sure some pests, not all pests will like that particular lure, even though most will. But we're trying to remove all pests from the landscape. So this is an important consideration. Density effect. This is more an average pest situation where if you reduce the density, pests will increase home range and start to act differently just because they have no neighbors. So we're considering this effect as well, and also genetics of the pests, because some can be resistant to, let's say, 1080 toxins, and also personality. There's coding in personality. There's genes in that code for personality that have been recently identified, and this could be brought into this research. And then the second part is, how can we target these survivors? So you look at sensory ecology, trying to understand the different drivers and attractants, different lure types, also the individual difference in how they respond to the different sensory cues, and how this will be based on motivations. Another cool aspect of this research is bringing in AI and computer learning. So being able to identify a pest and respond appropriate with certain cues could be highly advantageous. And we're using new technology such as infrared cameras to do this, which is, it's a different approach, but it really shows up how many animals are interacting with devices and not getting caught, because you can see them moving in the background. And this eradication science program is really all about collaboration, and it's Manaki Fenua-led project with funds MB, which was fantastic to get the funding, so all this research can go ahead. And we've teamed up with a lot of other partners who are main players in conservation in New Zealand, Department of Conservation to help catch survivors or operations, Predator Free New Zealand, or Predator Free 2050 for funding, and similarly National Science Challenge. Zip Helen Nathan is involved in landscape control, and Hawke's Bay, the councils have been very important, and Hawke's Bay in particular I've worked a lot with, but we want to be able to work with a lot of councils, so it's really about implementation, about what we find. There's no point in understanding unless it's applied and it works out. And there's also a large element of Vision Maturanga. We have HAPU research partners, and really what we want to develop is a culturally acceptable approach, and work with Maori to make sure it's acceptable, but also to use their knowledge of tradition and of trapping, because they're people that have been in the environment in New Zealand for a long time, and to help this inform the project and to ensure that any approach we have is culturally acceptable. And then for the sensory research, sensory aspect, working with the University of Sydney, University of Santa Cruz, some fantastic academics there. Also with the Cacophony Project, because they're experts on sensory cues, and we're collaborating with them. And one of the key important points is just a photograph of Puri Rackett-Stone and Graham Dixon. And these are people that understand management and understand the landscape, and they don't do the same thing all the time. They vary their approach to ensure that things work. And this, I think, is key. It's both a top-down behavioral understanding from academia, but also a bottom-up understanding from people on the landscape that really get what's happening here and are experts in removing the pests, and to very low density, which is what we want to achieve. And the personality research, we're working with UC Davis and University of Aberdeen, and also Alyssa Cameron from University of Canterbury, and again with the people on the ground to ensure that our approach is valid and uses the knowledge from both ends of the spectrum. And just finally, to conclude, behaviour and management they can both benefit from each other. I think I view it as a kind of a two-way street, because behaviour benefits pest management both in the efficacy, the effectiveness of it. As with the Stoat lure, there was very little extra cost or extra effort, but the outcomes were very important, and behaviour can benefit in that way. When we think of outcomes, you have to understand when you remove pests, how other pests will respond. So we better understand the outcomes, which is important to consider, because the purpose is conservation. And if you remove ferrets and stoats appear, and you're not removing stoats at the same rate, how will this affect the species survival? So that's key. Predator Free 2050, it's important, and from an animal ethics perspective, it's very important. And then the other way around, so pest management benefits behaviour. We can understand behaviour and sensory ecology. Conservation worldwide, because these same pests are often not doing as well in their home area, so it'd be great to be able to use our understanding for trapping here to improve their conservation at home. And finally, it's a great opportunity to work with communities, and students have a learning opportunity, and it's just a good project to be able to connect different institutes together to become more effective at pest management. And that's my lot. Thank you.
Cool, thank you for a great talk, Patrick, and thanks to everyone for sticking around as we've gone slightly over time. We've got quite a few questions, so we'll see how many we can get through. Our first question is, in the Tasman Valley, were stoats being excluded, or were they changing their behaviour to be less detectable, do you think?
Oh, it's a good question. That research hasn't actually been published, but we think what was happening was stoats were capable, ferrets were in situ in one part of the valley where there was, I think there was more rabbit numbers from memory, and that's where they were established. So I think it was that they were excluded, because when they were removed, they appeared, but it's a very homogeneous landscape. So it's not like stoats could have hiding in trees or stuff. It was very flat landscape. So I think it was that when we removed the ferrets, it created opportunities in this area for stoats that would have been productive areas if the ferrets hadn't been there.
Great. Our next question has been repeated by a few people, but for those of us running trapping projects, where would we get some cat or ferret scent to attract stoats?
Good question. We've actually been collecting ferret odour in Landcare Research for both research projects, and we've held animals in captivity and collected it. So actually you can get in contact with Claire Wilden from Landcare Research, and she should be able to help you out. But we're also developing a synthetic version of the lure, because obviously collecting odour is kind of limited in what we can do, but there is some available at the moment. But if we want to really do it at landscape scale across New Zealand, the best approach would be create a synthetic version if it worked as effectively.
And how was the predator odour applied in the traps in the FEO study? Was it specific extract or just a bit of ferret rubbed around the trap?
It was, so the ferret odour was collected by direct contact with the animal. There's difference between large males and small animals, but I won't get into that now. But there's some difference in the attractiveness of different individual ferrets. And then once it was collected, it was put on a piece of toweling and actually put in a little, like a tea strainer in the device, but often in the little place where the eggs are usually held is a good spot if there's no eggs, or else attached to the side of the Dock 250 if that's what's being used. And what you want is a free airflow, but you don't want the towel on the ground where it's going to get very damp, which will affect the odor release. But yeah, there's a few different approaches. I can imagine an onion net bag might work as well, but something that allows the air to flow and attached or placed to the side, and the animal has to pass through. And the one actually very important thing is that you don't want the stoat or a weasel or whatever it is to be able to detect or make contact with the odor from the outside. So it has to be in a bit from the wire, so it can get interested, but to find out all the information in the scent, it has to make contact with the scent. So there it has to go around and go into the trap, and it'll never get a chance.
Cool. So what motivation do you think the stoats have in more frequently visiting sites with the odour of a predator?
So, oh, I actually have a slide, do I? Oh no, ignore that one. There. That's the first time that's ever happened. Slide was actually prepared. So there's a few different, because there is a risk involved. If a stoat is approaching area with fresh predator odor, there is obvious risk involved because these animals can kill it. And that is one of the key pieces of information. From scent, you can tell how recently it was laid down by the strength of it. So you can use that for risk assessment. A 2-day-old scent compared to a very recent hour-old scent is very different. They can track down resources, and this is key for stoats and ferret scenario. Ferrets will kill rabbits or use den sites, and stoats can an opportunity to get resources, and maybe that's why when it was predator odor was coupled with the food resource, that they took the food resource, so it could be scavenging. They understand how to, so as I was showing, the time that a stoat was active was different from the time a ferret and cat is active. And to understand when those animals are active and to split up the time, it has to know where they were and when they were there. And scent could be a very important trigger for that. And also for mustelids, there's commonalities between the scents of, let's say, ferrets and stoats, and there could be some element of that to it as well. So all we can really say is that it's a very high value piece of information to the stoat, but understanding exactly why is yet to be figured out, really.
Great. And have you tested the predator scent in traps where there's a very low density of stoats in an environment that would replicate a pest-free island, for example?
No. Oh, actually, yes. So the similar scenario would be inside a pest sanctuary, like so we looked at different areas of fence sanctuaries, and there people have got in contact where a weasel has got inside the fence, and it's quite difficult to catch it. But this is kind of what I was getting at with the description I made before, because if you imagine a weasel is in the fence sanctuary, lots and lots of food around with all the birds and mice sometimes that are hard to keep out. But no competitors, nothing that is risky. So they're running around the environment, and you've a food lure in a trap. It's not really that tempting. But if you have a predator odor, then it is a lot more tempting, because they're who else is in the environment and who else is around here. I have to find out about this information. So we have used predator odor to trap a few weasels that got into a fence sanctuary, and I think this has been quite successful, but it hasn't been replicated in many places. But it worked well in a particular example I'm thinking of. They were 6 months trying to trap a weasel, and then they put in the ferret odor, and 2 weeks later they'd caught 2 weasels. They didn't know they had the second one, but it worked very effectively.
Cool. So we note that there appears to be tracking tunnel avoidance when rats have visited a tunnel. Is this a well-known thing?
Tracking tunnel avoidance by stoats?
I assume by stoats, yeah.
No, that wouldn't make any sense, because rats are prey of stoats, so there would be a higher likelihood that they would be there if the rats were there, that they'd have tracks. But there's other factors at play, because rats are arboreal, so they might come down and use traps maybe if there's not a lot of stoats in the particular area. So it mightn't be, they should overlap, because stoats will try to track down rats and catch them, and there's plenty of videos online and observations of that happening. So they should overlap. But if there's areas where you're not getting both traps, I'm not really sure why that is, but maybe rats are more likely to use them when there's no stoats in the environment, in the immediate environment, and that might be one possible reason. But I can't really imagine why that would happen generally.
And if stoats are attracted to the scent of their predators, do you think using scents could increase the risk of non-target species or potentially native species being attracted to
Well,
traps?
That's one of the great things about scent, because birds usually aren't like vision is so much a stronger sense for birds than scent. So scent shouldn't really increase the attraction to traps for birds. And that's one of the cool things about managing pests in New Zealand, because they're all mammals, primarily mammals that we're trying to do, and they're very different than birds, and we can use that difference to tease these apart and ensure that there's minimum like catching the wrong species. So we try to minimize that, and scent is a good way to distinguish it. I wouldn't imagine you should be increasing capture rates of native birds, but yeah, I wouldn't think that scent would influence it that greatly.
Cool. So I think this will be our last question, and then the others Patrick will respond to via email. So our last question is, do you think the stoat interest in ferret odour, is it possible they're also seeking social, such as age or sex information, to assess whether they're sharing habitat with a large or small predator or competitor population?
Completely, yeah. I think that information is available to them, and animals will just use information that's in the environment and freely available to reduce their risk and to increase their chances of getting resources. So there's a big difference for a stoat if there's a small, like in an interaction, a stoat is much more at risk from a large male ferret than a small female ferret. So sexual differences that are available to animals can be teased apart, and I think that could be part of the information that the stoat is getting out of it.
Great. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We hope we'll see many of you for the remaining talks the rest of this week.
Thanks.